I wasn't in a good place that late winter, and that's the plainest way I know to start this without dressing it up. My name is Earl Jennings. I was 59 then, and I had spent most of my adult life believing in things you could tighten, level, sharpen, stack, and measure. I ran crews at the sawmill for 26 years, moved up to foreman because I kept my head when blades jammed and tempers ran hot, and I trusted talk specs and weather reports more than any man's stories. If a claim couldn't survive daylight and a tape measure, I filed it with gossip and kept moving. That was my framework. Work hard, keep your hands steady. Solve what can be solved, and don't waste breath on mysteries. Then my wife died in September, and none of those rules helped me at all. Her name was Linda. She had a laugh that carried through 2 closed doors, and a way of tapping the counter twice before she turned the stove off, like she was signing her name to supper. Cancer took her in the stages that were somehow both slow and sudden. And I told myself I was handling it because I handled logistics well. I tracked appointments. I kept pill schedules in block letters on the fridge. I learned how to fold hospital blankets so they didn't bunch under her knees. I did all the practical things and called that love, which it was. But it wasn't the whole thing. And after the funeral, I discovered there was a ledger inside me with all the words I never said, written in ink I couldn't erase. I stopped showing up for people. That was the part I carried like wet wool. Folks brought casseroles for 2 weeks, then 1 week, then not at all, which is normal and kind and human. But I let even the kind ones drift because I couldn't bear the look in their faces when they asked how I was doing. My younger sister Darlene called every Sunday. I let it ring plenty of times. When I did pick up, I kept it clipped and practical, as if weather and taxes were enough to count as family. She had her own fight going in town with treatment, and I still found ways to make everything about how tired I felt. There's no noble version of that. I was lonely and mean in quiet ways. By the second week of February, my own place had turned into a museum of unfinished sentences. Her jacket was still on the peg by the back door. Her mug sat chipped on the right side, never moved. I'd stand in the kitchen and wait for the kettle just so I could hear something besides floorboards settling. Some nights I counted the whistles out loud like a fool. 1, 2, 3, and told myself that was routine, not need. Grief makes your habits strange and then convinces you they're sensible. I even started thanking appliances for working, which would have embarrassed me in any previous decade. Darlene finally called and didn't leave room for me to dodge. "Earl, listen to me," she said. "I need somebody at the cabin while I'm down here. Pipes froze once already. If that road gets chewed up, no one checks the place till thaw. You can stay there as long as you want. I can drive up and check it twice a week." "No," she said, and I could hear that treatment had roughed up her voice, but not her spine. "You can live there for a while and pretend you're helping me, and I can pretend I'm not helping you. We'll both sleep better." I sat on the edge of my bed with one boot on and one boot off, and stared at the wall long enough to hear her breathe through the line. "Earl, I'm here." "Then come up tomorrow. Bring Blue. He likes my porch better than yours anyway." That was my sister in one move. Direct, unsentimental mercy. The cabin sat on inherited ridgeland our granddad had logged with horses, then our father with old skidders, then me with better equipment and worse knees. It wasn't remote enough to disappear, but it was far enough out that silence had muscle. 1 lane in, 1 lane out, plus old logging spurs branching like cracked fingers into timber. Late winter up there had a specific texture. Frozen ruts in the morning, hard as iron, then thawing mud by noon that grabbed your boots and let go, slow. Thin light that never seemed to finish arriving. Spruce shadows long before supper time. Creek edges glazed with rotten ice you didn't trust. You could smell wet bark, diesel ghosted into old soil, and wood smoke if the wind turned right. Beautiful country, hard country, country that didn't care whether you believed in anything. Blue rode over in the passenger seat with his grey muzzle on the dash and his ears doing that half lift he got when roads got rough. He was 12 and arthritic in one hip, mostly hound with something stubborn mixed in, and he had outlived my temper more than once. At the cabin he made his circuit, porch to woodshed to cedar stump, then came back and sat beside me like we'd signed a lease. Inside smelled like pine cleaner, old coffee, and Darlene's lavender hand soap. Her treatment calendar was still pinned by the phone with check marks up to the week she left, neat and square. I stood there with my duffel hanging off one shoulder and felt like I'd broken into someone else's prayer. The first few days I kept to tasks because tasks don't ask questions. I split kindling, checked line pressure, bled air from the utility sink, laid down sand where the porch steps glazed over at dusk. I inventoried pantry shelves and wrote dates on masking tape with a carpenter pencil. I logged temperatures morning and evening in a little spiral pad that used to hold board-foot calculations. I called the mill and told them I needed another month before coming back part-time. My superintendent said, "Take what you need, Earl," and I said, "I won't be soft forever," which was an odd thing to say to a man who hadn't called me soft. 3 days later, Darlene asked on the phone if I was eating vegetables. I told her yes. She asked if I was lying. I told her less than before. "I'm serious," she said. "You get tunnel vision when you're hurting. Don't build a life out of coffee and canned chili." I made eggs. Eggs are not a vegetable. "Chicken adjacent," I said, and she laughed, quick and tired, and for a second I heard the version of us from 15 years earlier, arguing over pie crust at Thanksgiving. That kind of moment could hold you up for hours. Nights were the longest. The cabin popped and settled with temperature swings, and wind found every seam no matter how much weather strip you stuffed in. I would bank the stove, sit at the table, and look out at the dark line of trees beyond the yard light. Not afraid, just aware of how much room there was between me and the next porch light. I thought about Linda most when I was too tired to defend myself against memory. The way she tucked her feet under her in the recliner. The way she always claimed she couldn't hear the rain, then identified the exact minute it changed to sleet. I had spent months acting like survival meant staying busy enough not to feel anything. In that cabin, with Blue snoring by the stove and no reason to perform competence for anybody, the feelings arrived anyway, slow and non-negotiable. A primary consideration in grief, at least in my experience, is that guilt can wear a practical mask. You tell yourself you're preserving energy. You tell yourself you can't be useful to others until you're fully upright again. You call it recovery, but underneath it is avoidance with clean boots. I had avoided church folks, neighbours, my own sister, and even the mill guys who would have sat on a tailgate with me in silence and called that company. I had become a man who answered kindness with distance, because distance required less courage. I knew it. Knowing didn't fix it. Toward the end of that month, I started walking the old logging road each afternoon, partly for Blue's joints, and partly because if I stayed inside too long, I heard every missing sound in the world. The road dropped from Darlene's place down toward the creek crossing, cut left by a blown fir, then climbed toward the carving meadow on the north bench. It was private land, posted where it counted, but folks still drifted through after dark when they thought nobody was watching. You learned to read disturbance the way some men read newspapers. Fresh tire bite in soft shoulders, bottle caps in culverts, cigarette filters pressed into mud, feed sacks where no rancher had business leaving feed sacks. On the last Tuesday of February, I found boot marks where there should have been none. Deep heel blocks with chain pattern worn smooth at the toe, heading in and out on the same line near the old switchback. A little farther on, I found 2 burlap bait sacks tucked under a deadfall, damp and rank with grain, and something sweeter that turned my stomach. Not legal set-up material. Not for anything decent. I stood there with Blue pulling lightly at the leash and felt that old foreman part of my brain wake up and start categorizing. Number of people, direction of travel, likely return window, risk to stock, risk to wildlife, risk to structures. Locals called that crew the Chain Line Boys, though nobody said it loud in the diner unless they trusted everyone within earshot. Men who worked after dark, cut sign when wardens were around, and treated closed spurs like suggestions. They weren't movie villains. They were worse in the ordinary way, casual about damage because none of it belonged to them. If they kept using that road through Thor, Darlene's place would become a waypoint whether I liked it or not, and the carving meadow above the creek would get stripped of anything that moved by spring. I bagged one of the sacks with gloves and set it in the shed to show a warden if it came to that. I photographed the boot tread with my phone and a folding ruler for scale, because habit is habit, and because facts matter when you're trying to be believed. Then I stood in the yard with melting sleet tapping my jacket and realized I was trembling, not from cold. Helplessness had a taste to it, metallic and old. I had tasted it in oncology hallways. I recognized it now on a ridge road. Blue leaned against my leg until I steadied. I wish I could tell you I turned fierce right there, that I became the man from the stories where grief gets forged into purpose in one clean scene. Truth was less cinematic. I felt tired down to the hinges. I felt late to my own life. I looked at Darlene's dark windows and her stacked split cedar and the little tin star she kept nailed over the porch light, and I wasn't sure I had enough left in me to protect anything at all. I stood there until sleet turned to a finer, colder rain and started threading down the back of my collar. Then I picked up the bait sack, carried it to the shed, and set it on an empty fertilizer tub like it might leak bad luck into the floorboards. Blue watched me with that patient hound look, not pushing, just waiting for me to choose the next thing. I didn't have one. That was the truth of it. My whole working life I had believed every problem had a tool order: assess, secure, report, fix. Out on that ridge with poacher sign on the road and my sister in treatment 2 counties away, my tool order had come up short. I went inside and hung my wet jacket by the stove. Water ticked off the hem onto the mat Darlene kept by the door, the one with pine cones stitched in fading green. I made coffee I didn't want, drank half a cup anyway, and sat at the table with my notebook open and my pen idle. I wrote, "Boot tread near switchback," and underlined it twice, then stared through the window at the dark line of timber and could not think past the next hour. Grief had taught me that helplessness arrived in layers. First, the obvious crisis, then the smaller, meaner one where you stop trusting your own capacity. I had spent months in that second layer pretending it was caution. By full dark, the rain hardened again. Sleet tapped the roof in little hard clicks that sounded like someone sorting nails on sheet metal. Blue shifted from the rug to the hearth and sighed so deep his ears flapped. I tried the radio for company and got static and one country station fading in and out under weather chatter. I shut it off. Silence returned, dense and familiar. It pressed at the windows and sat with me at the table like another body. I remember thinking, plain as day, I couldn't keep living as a man who only guarded what was already gone. That was what I had done since Linda's funeral. I guarded old routines, old rooms, old pain. I kept watch over memory like it needed defending and let the present fend for itself. Sitting there with sleet outside and Darlene's grocery list still stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout, I felt ashamed in a clean, useful way for once. Not the shame that folds you inward, the kind that points your boots towards something. I pulled on dry socks, laced my work boots, and took Blue out with a headlamp and my walking stick. I wasn't hunting for trouble, I just needed to see the road again at night, needed to feel the ground under me and confirm that I still belonged to a world made of physical things. The yard light cast a weak yellow pool over the porch steps and then gave up. Beyond that, the ridge opened into wet black trunks and low drifting mist. Our breath showed white. The sleet had slowed to a fine grain that hissed in the leaves. Blue moved close to my left knee on the downhill stretch, nails clicking on the harder patches, paws slipping softly where mud had thawed. We went as far as the first bend and stopped. I killed the lamp and listened. Creak noise in the distance. Wind up high in fir boughs. No engine, no human voices. My chest eased a notch, then tightened again for no clear reason, same as it had done in hospital parking lots when the doctor had that careful look before he spoke. I hated that my body had learned that feeling so well. I talked out loud to the dark because there was no one there to hear me and no point pretending otherwise. "I'm trying," I said, and it came out rough. "I'm late, but I'm trying." Blue flicked an ear back at me and kept watching the trees. I stood there with my hand on his collar and let the cold find the spots my jacket didn't cover. I missed my wife with an ache that had edges. I missed being known in ordinary ways. I missed saying one sentence and not having to explain where it came from. When we came back up the rise, the cabin looked small and stubborn, one square of warm light in a long, wet night. I wiped Blue's paws with an old towel, fed him, then fried potatoes and onions and ate standing at the counter. At some point, I laughed at myself for salting the potatoes twice, and then blaming the spoon. It was a short laugh, maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like finding a dry match in damp pockets. I phoned Darlene after 9 because she stayed up on treatment days and I knew she'd be awake. "You sound tired," she said. "Road's a mess. Found sign I didn't like." "People?" "Yeah, on the lower switchback. I bagged what I could." There was a pause, then her voice softened without getting fragile. "You calling a warden?" "In the morning, I wanted clearer photos first." "Do what you do, Earl. Facts first." I swallowed and looked at the window over the sink, black glass with my own face faint in it. "You doing all right tonight?" "I'm upright and cranky," she said. "Nurse says that's a good forecast." That got a breath of a laugh out of me. She added, "Eat something green tomorrow, or I'll drive up and supervise." "You're 30 pounds in a blood test right now. You're not supervising anything." "Watch me," she said, and we both let that sit there like a promise we could borrow. After we hung up, I checked the door latch twice, banked the stove, and lay down fully clothed on top of the blanket. Sleep came in scraps. In between, I listened for engines and heard only weather and the old house sounds of wood, shrinking, settling, easing into cold. Somewhere toward morning, I got up, stirred coals, and stood at the window until the east side of the ridge turned from black to charcoal. And by Thursday, the storm had passed and left that thin, pewter light that made every branch look etched. I took Blue up toward the timberline behind the cabin instead of down the road. He usually announced every squirrel and jay like a union steward calling roll. But that morning, he went quiet halfway to the cedar stump and stayed quiet. Not tense, not scared. Just attentive in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was young and still hunting rabbits on my uncle's place. His tail lowered, then gave one slow sweep. He looked into the trees and sat. "Go on," I whispered, because whispering felt right, even though I didn't know why. He didn't move. He sat like he was waiting on someone polite enough to arrive at their own speed. The woods held stillness differently than normal, I don't mean dead silence. There was wind and distant water, and the creak of a snag rubbing another snag. But the usual scatter of little sounds had narrowed. No chickadees fussing over territory. No nuthatches hopping bark. Even the jays who loved drama more than fairness kept to themselves. I felt watched, but not in the way that raises the hair on your neck. More like being observed by something patient that had no wish to crowd you. I stood there a full minute, maybe more, hand on my stick, Blue seated at my boot. Then he rose on his own, nosed my glove once and turned back toward the house. It wasn't refusal. It felt like agreement, as if whatever he had come to acknowledge was acknowledged, and that was enough for the morning. When we reached the porch, I stopped so abruptly, Blue bumped my calf. Beside the chopping block, under the little overhang where sleet hadn't reached, sat a tidy stack of dry kindling. Not just tossed there, stacked by length, bark sides mostly aligned, split faces turned in so they'd shed damp air. I knew every piece of wood I had cut that week. This wasn't mine. The species mix was wrong for my pile, and the splits were cleaner than what I could do with my left elbow still barking in cold weather. 8, maybe 10 armloads worth, all of it dry as kiln scrap. I looked around the yard, then toward the tree line, then back at the stack like it might explain itself if I stared hard enough. No tire tracks near the porch, no fresh boot marks through the mud by the pump. Just the usual Thor ripples, Blue's prints, my own from earlier. I crouched and touched the top piece. Dry, warm from trapped air under the overhang, not from recent handling. A few bits still had pale cambium showing, cut recent, but not fresh. "Okay," I said to nobody. "That's odd." Blue sniffed the pile, sneezed once, and settled near it with his chin on his paws, calm as Sunday afternoon. If a stranger had come that close in the night, he'd have raised a fuss loud enough to wake the county. He hadn't. That landed harder than the wood itself. I carried 2 armloads inside and set them by the stove. They caught quick when I lit the morning fire. Clean flame, almost no hiss. Whoever stacked them knew exactly what a wet ridge week demanded. I ate toast standing up and kept glancing out at the remaining pile like it might walk off if I looked away. Practical explanations lined up in my head and fell over one by one. Neighbour helping? Cal lived 4 miles by road and usually called first. Random hunter? No hunter split and stacked prime kindling as a prank. My own forgetfulness? Not at that volume. Not with that cut. Later that afternoon, the sun broke through in thin bars, and I took Blue down to the road edge again, partly to check the switchback, partly because my mind would not sit still. Near the path where alder roots crossed the mud, I saw the first broad print. It looked like bear at a glance. Front pad deep, toes clear, but the spacing to the next impression was too clean, almost measured. Another print sat 12 feet farther. Same angle, same depth, then another arcing toward the side yard. No scuff entry from the trees, no obvious approach trail, just a looping line that seemed to begin and end wherever it pleased. I stepped around one and, without planning it, said, "Excuse me," like I was passing somebody in a grocery aisle. Then I heard my own words and laughed once, short and dry. "Well, Earl," I told the empty yard, "grief has made you courteous to phantom bears." Blue did not laugh at me, which was rude of him, but he did walk to the nearest print, sniff it, and sit down again facing the timberline, tail resting still in the mud, as if he had resumed a conversation I couldn't yet hear. Blue held that seated posture so steady it made me uneasy in a new way. Not scared, just aware that he understood a pattern I hadn't caught up to yet. I stepped around the print he'd been studying and looked for entry sign again, then exit sign, then anything that connected those broad tracks to ordinary movement, through mud. There was nothing cleanly connecting them. The impressions looped the yard in a wide ring, crossed by the woodpile, touched the side path toward the pump, then curved back toward the lower trail like someone had drawn a boundary with careful intent. I walked it twice, measuring stride with my own boots, and each time I came back with the same result. Whatever made those marks moved in a rhythm too deliberate to be random and too consistent to be sloppy. I went inside, grabbed my notebook and folding ruler, and came back out with Blue trailing me. At the first print, I knelt and wrote depth, width, toe spread, orientation. At the second, I noted that the front edge was crisp where thawed mud should have slumped. At the third, I marked that the spacing to the next track matched within a half-inch. I felt silly and serious all at once. A man crouched in wet ground doing field notes on something he would have mocked 6 months earlier. Still, facts were facts. I photographed each mark with scale in frame and the porch corner behind it for reference. Then I looked at Blue and said, "If this is a prank, it's the most organized prank in county history." He blinked at me, unconvinced by my sarcasm, and stared back toward the trees. Curiosity had a different weight than grief. Grief dragged, curiosity pulled. I could feel the shift in my body as plain as a gear catching. Shoulders up, breath shallow, mind turning over details instead of circling old pain. I followed the lower path past the cedar stump and down to the first junction where the logging spur split right toward the creek crossing and left toward the old skid lane. More of the same prints waited there, broad and confident in the mud, exactly where anyone scouting for access would pause and choose a route. Another set sat beside the blind corner below the switchback, where headlights from an approaching truck didn't show up until late. Another pair lay near the creek stones where men in boots liked to step dry. None of them cut through the carving meadow. None of them cut through game trails. They occupied decision points. By the time we climbed back to the cabin, I'd run through 3 practical explanations and stripped them down. Oversized mold stamps, possible in theory, but whoever used them would have had to walk in without leaving one clear human track in soft thaw. Misread bare movement in patchy melt. Unlikely because there was no random wander, no foraging scatter, no claw drag. Neighbor trying to spook trespassers. Conceivable, but no neighbor I knew would stage sign this precisely and then haul in dry kindling on top of it. I stood on the porch with my notebook damp at the edges and said the only honest thing left. I don't know. Saying it out loud was strangely relieving. Morning stayed thin and bright, the kind of brittle light that made every puddle wear ice at the edges again, and by noon the switchback had thawed into black pudding mud that held tracks like wet cement. Blue and I took the road early while it still had a crust. At the lower bend I found fresh boot tread from 2 men, maybe 3, overlying yesterday's softening ruts. Chain pattern near the heel, smooth at the toe, same as before. They'd come in after dark and turned out before first light. 10 feet beyond their turnaround spot sat 2 brand new broad prints pressed deep and angled across their line, as if a large bear had crossed right after them. Another mark sat farther uphill, positioned where a driver would see it in full beam and think twice. I crouched there a long time, fingertips resting on my knee, studying edge crumble and moisture sheen. The print was recent enough that water hadn't pooled at the base. I could see a faint side ridge where something broad had pressed mud not down, but outward. I took more photos, then stood and scanned the timber. The woods were active in all the ordinary ways, a pair of crows arguing above the draw, squirrels cutting diagonal runs through duff, a deer track crossing old leaf litter. No panic movement. No alarm bursts. Blue sniffed the print once, huffed, and moved on as if he'd inspected work done to standard. Halfway back up, I heard the first footfall. It came from my right, uphill in the firs, heavy enough to register through wet ground before it reached my ears. One step, then another, not hurried, not stalking, just weight placed with care. I stopped. The sound stopped. I walked 6 paces. It resumed, matching distance without closing. The rational part of my mind told me elk could move quietly when they wanted to, and old trees popped in thaw and sound bounced strange off ravines. The rest of me knew this was paced movement. Intentional. Patient. I turned my head slowly toward the slope and saw only trunks and shadow bands. Blue stood beside me, relaxed, tail low, looking the same direction with ears forward but no growl in him at all. I kept walking uphill and spoke at normal volume because whispering would have made it feel theatrical. "I'm heading to the cabin," I said, "not looking for trouble." The footfalls followed for another 30 yards, then faded as we entered the open strip by the yard. I set my stick on the porch and only then noticed my hands were shaking. Not fear exactly, adrenaline and bewilderment, braided tight. I stood there in daylight with a hound who trusted the unseen and felt my old certainty thinning at the edges. I called Cal around lunch because if I didn't say any of this out loud to another human, I was going to start doubting my own recall. He answered on the 3rd ring over the noise of a diesel engine. "Cal, it's Earl, you busy?" "Always, talk." I watched sleet water drip from the eaves while I chose my words. If I say what I saw, you'll think I'm cracked. His engine noise dropped, maybe because he stepped out of the cab. "You're not cracked, just late to what these hills already know." I let that sit for a beat. I've got Big Bear sign around Darlene's place, but it's wrong in the details. Shows up where poachers scout. No livestock hit. Blue's calm every time. And something paced me on the slope this morning. Stopped when I stopped. Cal exhaled through his nose. "Chainline boys superstitious?" "Mean enough to be, yeah." "Then hear me. If they think an aggressive sow's denning that drainage, they'll shift routes. Men like that don't fear wardens half as much as they fear what they can't predict." "You saying somebody's helping me stage this?" "I'm saying pay attention to outcomes, not pride. Keep documenting. Don't chase what doesn't want chasing." That was 90 seconds of conversation, maybe 2 minutes, and it settled me more than I expected. Not because it explained anything, but because it gave me a useful frame. Observe, record, protect the ground in front of me. I could do that. That afternoon I set up near the alder run above the creek crossing where the spur narrowed between 2 mossed boulders. It was a place sign had been appearing in neat intervals, and the mud there held shape even after light rain. I brought a thermos, my notebook, and Blue's old blanket to sit on, and I tucked us behind a wind-thrown spruce with enough cover to watch without standing in the open. The air smelled of thawing earth and cedar rot, with that cold metal scent water carries when snowmelt starts moving in volume. Light drained slowly through the trees, turning from pewter to tobacco brown. Blue lay with his head on his paws, eyes open, not restless. While we waited, my mind started its old defensive routine, and I let it run because fighting it never helped. I told myself this couldn't be real, that grief had already bent my sense of proportion once and could do it again. I told myself I was a sawmill foreman on leave, a widower who counted kettle whistles, a man overdue for sleep, and those facts made perception slippery. Then another part of me spoke up, quieter and steadier. I am here now, in cold mud, with a notebook full of measurable details. I have prints layered over poacher boot treads. I have a dog who warns at strangers and rests easy in this presence. I have kindling I did not cut stacked by someone who understood weather better than most men I know. I don't need a theory tonight. I need to look straight at what is happening. and not lie about it later. Near dusk, the woods ahead changed in a way I felt before I saw it. Not silence exactly, more like a soft gathering of attention. Two jays that had been fussing upstream went quiet. A mule deer doe stepped from alder shadow 30 yards out, ears forward, then paused without bolting. Behind her, half hidden in brush, a fawn struggled against something at ground level and gave a thin, breathy bleat. I lifted my binoculars and saw the wire first. A snare loop cinched above the fetlock, staked low to a buried anchor. Illegal, cruel, efficient. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Then he appeared. A dark shape rose from behind a cedar trunk farther back, higher than the surrounding brush by an amount my brain rejected on first pass. He moved into the open with unhurried control, broad through shoulders and torso, fur matted dark from sleet, long arms held low and relaxed. 8 feet, maybe more, but scale gets slippery when shock hits. What stayed clear was his movement, each step placed to avoid snapping deadfall, each shift of weight balanced so the ground barely protested. No charge, no dominance display, no threat posture. He angled his body so he was between the doe and the snare, then lowered into a kneel with a care I have seen in nurses adjusting an IV line. The doe backed 2 paces but did not flee. The fawn kicked once, panicked, then stilled as that enormous hand slid under the wire and lifted just enough to take pressure off the leg. With the other hand, he twisted the snare lock against tension, found the weak point and snapped it free. Not ripped. Freed. He held the loop open until the fawn pulled clear, then set the broken wire on a stump instead of tossing it. The fawn lurched to its feet and pressed against the doe, both of them standing there a heartbeat longer, as if catching their breath, then moved uphill into cover. I had forgotten to breathe. Blue made a soft sound in his throat, not warning, almost a sigh. The big figure remained kneeling by the disturbed mud. He reached to the side, scooped a palmful of wet soil, and pressed it with the outer edge of his hand into a broad, bear-like track beside the snare site. Then another, offset with clean spacing toward the spur. He rose, took 3 slow steps, and shaped one more print near the trail junction where anyone coming through at night would spot it in a headlamp beam. It was deliberate work, strategic as survey stakes. He turned his head then and looked straight toward our hiding place. Distance held between us, maybe 40 yards, maybe a little more. In that dim light, his eyes caught amber brown for a second, calm and assessing, with no push in them. I knew, somehow, that I wasn't in danger. The line that formed in my mind was simple and complete. He knew I was here, and he was leaving me room to stay here. Mutual boundary, mutual purpose. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. Not from fear, but from recognition of something I had gone months without. Company that asked nothing and still counted me in the circle of concern. He dipped his head once, barely, then stepped backward into alder shadow and was gone, with astonishing quiet for his size. No crashing retreat, just absence where presence had been. I stayed still until the last light bled out and the cold worked through my coat. When I finally stood, my knees shook. We walked to the snare site with headlamps low. The broken wire lay exactly where he'd placed it, coiled neat on the stump. The mud prints were there, large and convincing at a glance. But up close I could see the subtle side press pattern I'd noticed earlier, the signature of a broad hand-shaping signal rather than an animal passing through. I bagged the wire, photographed the impressions, and marked the coordinates in my notebook. On the climb back, Blue ranged 2 steps ahead, then 2 steps back, checking me like he did when my left knee acted up. At the porch, he paused beside the ring of tracks, sniffed once, and settled against my boot. I put my palm on his neck and looked out at the dark timberline where we had been watched and, in a way I still can't fully explain, watched over. Grief was still there. So was guilt. But for the first time in months, they were not the only things in the room. I kept my hand on Blue's neck until my fingers warmed under his fur. Then I went inside and laid the broken snare wire on the table like a tool I hadn't learned yet. The coil held its shape, sharp memory in steel, and I stared at it longer than I meant to. I wanted to call what I'd seen exhaustion, stress, late light, anything with a tidy name. But the wire was real, and the photos were real, and the mud still held those broad pressed marks where a hand had done careful work. I made coffee, forgot to drink it, and sat with my notebook open while the stove ticked itself hotter. Blue curled under the table and slept hard, the way dogs do after something important has gone right. I wrote down every sequence from the Alder run, not because writing made it less strange, but because precision kept me honest. Doe at 30 yards, fawn snared at ground level. Figure entered from cedar line, released loop with controlled pressure, shaped decoy tracks at junction, maintained distance, no threat display. I underlined that last part twice. Then I laughed at myself, quiet and short, because there I was at midnight documenting a 9-foot mystery like I was filling out a maintenance log. If anybody had told younger me this was coming, I'd have asked what they'd been drinking and whether they brought enough for the class. I did call Cal, though it was late enough I expected voicemail. He picked up on the 4th ring. "You all right?" "Yeah," I said. "No, both." I watched him free a fawn from a snare by the creek. Then he made those prints again, right where the road cuts left. Cal was quiet for a beat. "You get hurt?" "No." "Dog?" "Blue's fine, calm the whole time." "That tells me plenty," he said. "Bag the wire, mark where you found it. Call wardens at first light and keep your words plain. Don't lead with what they can't process." I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. "What do I call what I saw then?" "You call it help," he said, and hung there with me another few breaths before we said goodnight. I slept in scraps again, but the scraps were different. My mind kept replaying that kneeling shape in the dim, older light, all that size folded into restraint. Near dawn, I got up, fed Blue, and stepped onto the porch with my mug. The ridge was silver with low fog, and meltwater dripped off the eaves in steady beads. The ring of prints in the yard had softened at the edges overnight, but the spacing still looked intentional. The line still looked like a message set where men would notice it and back off. I stood there in my flannel and old canvas coat, coffee cooling in my hand, and admitted the thing I had resisted for weeks. This presence wasn't blundering through my life by accident. It was choosing points, timing, and distance like a partner who understood boundaries better than most people. At 7:30, I called State Dispatch and asked for game enforcement. I gave my name, parcel number, and a short report. Illegal snare recovered at Creek Spur, repeated trespass sign, recurring large tracks around protected structures, possible poaching activity tied to known nighttime traffic. The dispatcher transferred me to Warden Pike. He sounded brisk, not dismissive. "You got physical evidence in hand?" "One snare wire bagged, photos of tread and placement, more to show on site." "Any direct contact with suspects?" "Not yet." "Any livestock hit?" "None." He paused, pen scratching. "I can swing your drainage tomorrow afternoon. You keep yourself out of confrontation, Mr. Jennings. Document and step back." "I can do that." Before we hung up, he gave me a report number. I wrote it across the top of a fresh page and circled it. Outcome, process, next step. I could breathe inside that, By the next afternoon, the freeze-thaw cycle had turned the lower road into slick clay with a crust on top, and Blue and I headed toward the calving meadow fence line with fencing pliers, a post maul, and 2 replacement staples in my jacket pocket. I had a practical excuse to be there. One section always loosened where the ground heaved. Still, I knew I was also checking for new sign. Curiosity had moved into the house and unpacked. The meadow sat in a shallow bowl ringed by fir and alder, grass flattened pale from snow load, creek noise low and steady beyond the far bank. A hawk rode one thermal and then disappeared behind the ridge. No engines, no human calls. Blue worked ahead with his nose down, then circled back to me, then angled toward the old game trail that crossed near the broken fence brace. I was tamping a post with the maul when I heard his yelp. It was one sharp cry, cut short. I dropped the maul and got there in 3 strides. Blue had his right front paw pinned in a concealed loop under leaf litter and slush, wire cinched above the pad. He wasn't thrashing yet, just panting hard, eyes white at the corners, trying to hold still because he trusted me and hurt anyway. My stomach dropped clean through me. "Easy, boy. Easy. I got you." I knelt in mud, slid my hand under his chest, and looked for the anchor point. It was staked deep under frozen duff, spring tension tight enough that my bare fingers couldn't trip it without a tool. I reached for my pliers and realized I'd left them by the fence post 10 yards back. I swore once, low, and Blue trembled harder. Then the careful footfalls came from the tree line behind us, heavy and measured, and stopped at the edge of the meadow. I turned and saw him in full daylight for the first time. He stood just inside shadow, dark fur carrying streaks of wet bark and old leaves, shoulders broad enough to make the trunk behind him look narrow. His face was clearer now than it had been by dusk. Deep-set eyes, broad nose, grey threading the fur around his jaw. Not young, not hurried, watchful in a way that felt ancient and present at once. He did not advance until I shifted my weight back and took my hands off the wire. Even then he came only halfway, circling wide so he never crowded me, stopping opposite Blue with 2 arm lengths of space between us. My mind tried one last rational scramble and failed. Nothing about him fit costume, prank, or misread wildlife. Scale, motion, choice. Each element aligned with what I had seen before, only clearer. The crux was no longer whether he was real. The crux was whether I could stay steady enough to accept help without turning it into panic. "I'm not fighting you," I said, voice thin but stable. "He's my dog." He tilted his head once, then lowered to a knee with astonishing control. One massive hand pressed the spring arm through a forked stick he had carried in, pinning tension without jerking. The other hand eased the wire loop up and over Blue's paw in one smooth motion. No yank, no rush. Blue whimpered, then went still. Then, when the pressure released, pulled his paw free and tucked against my hip. The big hand withdrew immediately, open and empty. I checked Blue's leg with shaking fingers. Red groove, no break, no deformity. He could bear weight. Barely at first, then better. I was still crouched there when Blue did something that took the last of my defenses with it. He limped one step forward, sniffed that enormous wrist, and gave it a quick, gentle lick before returning to my side. The creature stayed motionless, receiving that small trust like it mattered. I sat back on my heels in the wet grass and felt my throat close up. For months I had been carrying the private conviction that I failed the ones I loved the minute things turned beyond my control. In one quiet meadow, with no witness but a hound and wind in dry reeds, I watched a being I could not explain treat my dog's pain like it was urgent and worthy. Tenderness at that scale did something to me I still struggle to name. He rose, stepped to the snare anchor, and pulled the stake from frozen ground with a single steady draw. Then he walked 10 feet to a patch of soft mud near the trail junction and pressed 3 broad bear-like prints in a line, leading away from the meadow toward the lower spur. Deliberate misdirection. Protective theatre. Same strategy, different sight. When he finished, he carried the sprung snare and stake to the edge of the path and set them on a flat stone where I could not miss them. Evidence, not chaos. He looked at me one more time across that distance. I nodded without deciding to. He answered with the smallest dip of his chin, turned, and moved into the trees so quietly the branches barely twitched. I stayed kneeling until Blue nudged my shoulder hard enough to tip me forward. Then I stood, wiped my face with my sleeve, and laughed once through the sting in my eyes because I had mud on both knees. One boot unlaced, and I had just silently coordinated a snare removal with a mountain giant, like it was a Tuesday chore list. Life had gotten strange beyond argument. I gathered the snare, stake, and forked stick. I photographed Blue's paw, the trap bed, the print line, and the placement stone from multiple angles with my ruler in frame. Back at the cabin, I cleaned Blue's leg with warm water and diluted iodine while he leaned against me and sighed. He ate supper with his usual appetite, then slept near the door, one ear up like he was on light watch for old friends. Warden Pike arrived just before dusk in a mud-splashed state truck and walked the yard with me while I showed him the bagged wire from last night, today's recovered snare, and the photo set on my phone. He crouched over the ring prints by the pump, then the fresher ones at the lower path. "You're telling me these keep appearing around access points?" he asked. "Yes. Junctions, blind corners, creek crossing, and now the meadow edge." "And your dog got caught in this one today?" "Right front paw. Superficial. I cleaned it." He stood and adjusted his hat, eyes on the timberline. "I can't cite a myth, Mr. Jennings, but I can cite trespass, illegal sets, and baiting if we tie plates to movement. You got cameras?" "2 trail cams and 1 old dash cam I can rig at the switchback." "Do it. I'll log this as active poaching concern with bear activity advisement. That gives us more patrol authority on paper." Outcome. Not perfect, but real. He took both snares for chain of custody, gave me a receipt, and told me he'd call within 72 hours with any plate matches from nearby roads. Before he left, he looked down at Blue and then back at me. "Keep him close for a while. Plan is not to let him out of arm's reach." After his taillights dropped down the spur, the ridge went quiet again, evening blue settling into the trees. I ate at the counter because I was too tired to sit, then carried a chair to the porch and listened to creek water work through thaw. Blue lay at my boots, paw bandaged, breathing easy. Across the yard, the broad prints around Darlene's cabin had begun to blur at the edges with melt, but the circle they traced was still readable if you knew what you were looking for. Not menace, not ownership, just a boundary drawn for protection. I turned the smooth stone from the porch step in my palm and watched dark gather at the timberline. The world stayed hard, same as ever. Mud, illness, men who set wire where living things walk. But sitting there with my dog safe and my sister's cabin standing in that ring of deliberate sign, I could no longer call the world empty. I sat there with that stone in my palm until it warmed to my skin, and the quiet stopped feeling like something I had to endure and started feeling like something that was holding me up. Blue's breathing had a slow, even pull to it, one ear lifting now and then when branches clicked in the cooling air. The porch light made a soft, yellow oval on the boards, and beyond it, the yard dropped into blue shadow where those broad prints were already blurring at the edges. I kept looking at them anyway, not to prove anything, just to let my mind settle where my eyes could follow. What broke open in me did not arrive dramatic. It arrived like thaw water finding a seam in old ice. I thought about Linda in the hospital chair by the window, hair gone and smile intact, still asking if I'd eaten lunch when she was the one getting medicine run into her arm. I thought about all the answers I gave her that were practical and true, but smaller than what she deserved. I thought about Darlene, thin and stubborn in town, making jokes through treatment and still finding room to rescue her older brother from his own locked house. Then I looked down at Blue, with his bandaged paw and his trust intact, and I felt the weight I had been carrying finally shift from my chest into my hands, where it belonged. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, and cried in a way I had avoided for months. No shouting, no collapse, just steady tears, and the kind of breathing that hurts at first, and then steadies out. I said Linda's name out loud 3 times so it would live in the cold air and not just inside my head. I told her I was sorry for every moment I hid behind checklists when I should have sat still, and told her I was scared too. I told her I loved her, plain and late and true. I told her I was still here. I told her I was trying to come back to the people who were still here too. Blue pushed his muzzle under my hand and held it there. "Yeah," I said to him, voice rough. "I know, we're doing better than we were." I laughed once through the tears because a 59-year-old sawmill foreman crying into a porch railing while taking comfort from a dog in a crooked bandage was not how I had pictured my winter. If pride had still been running my schedule, I would have missed the best part of that night. By the time the stove had burned down to red seams in the coals, wet snow had started, soft at first, then thicker, each flake catching porch light before drifting past into dark. I took Blue inside, settled him on his blanket by the door, and set the dashcam in the front window pointed down the lower approach. I checked the trail cam feed from the old tablet twice, then once more, because worry makes habits repetitive. At a little past 10, while I was rinsing my mug, headlights rolled across the far wall of the kitchen in a slow sweep that did not belong to any neighbor I knew. I killed the interior lights and moved to the window. 2 pickups idled low on the lower switchback, beams cut through snow, one angled toward the spur like they were deciding whether to commit. Engines stayed running. No doors opened yet. Blue lifted his head, but did not bark. My stomach tightened the way it used to before bad meetings at the mill, that blend of readiness and dread where your body knows stakes before your mind assembles them. I grabbed my coat, stepped onto the porch, and stood just inside the light so I could see without outlining myself too clearly. Snow hissed against my sleeves. Down below, one set of headlights swung wider, then paused again. They were close enough now to make out the general shape of men in caps, moving in the cab glow. I had no interest in direct contact and no illusion I could outmuscle 3 men on a muddy night. I held my phone ready for plates and stayed where the camera lane covered the road. Then, movement drew my eyes to the meadow edge above the cabin. He came out of the firs in one unhurried line, dark against the pale sweep of snow, taller than the fence posts by half again, and broad enough that, for a second, my mind still tried to shrink him, to fit older beliefs. He did not look toward the trucks first. He looked toward the porch, toward me. Distance held, deliberate and respectful, the same boundary he had kept from the start. He gave one slight tilt of his head, almost a question, then turned to the yard and went to work. What happened next had the precision of a practiced crew move, except it was one being doing the work of 3 men with care instead of force. He stepped around the porch in a wide arc, pressing deep, oversized bear tracks at regular intervals where fresh snow would show them clearly by dawn, and where headlights could catch them now. He crossed to the windfall near the pump and raked out a shallow hollow under the root mass that looked, even from my angle, like the beginning of a den. He stripped wet bark from a downed log and dragged the scent-heavy sections to narrow the easiest approach path, not blocking it fully, just channeling movement toward the open lane where my camera had line of sight. Every placement had intent. Every gesture said the same thing in practical language: turn around or walk into evidence. One pickup revved once and rolled forward 20 feet. Its headlights found the nearest fresh print in full beam. The truck stopped hard enough that the nose dipped. Driver's door opened, then shut again without anyone stepping out. The second truck swung its lights toward the root hollow and the raked earth. I could not hear their words over engines and snow, but I saw the shape of hesitation take hold. They sat another 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then the lead truck backed carefully, tires spinning once in the slush, before catching. The second followed. Red tail lights bobbed downhill, disappeared around the bend, and did not return. I had my phone up the whole time, recording as steady as my hands allowed. My chest was tight, but not with panic. It felt like a locked room finally getting a window opened. He finished the last track near the side path, then crossed to the stump by the porch where Darlene used to set flower pots in summer. He picked up 2 river stones from the edge of the steps, turned them once in his palm, and set them in a small cross on top of the stump, neat and centered. No flourish, no performance. A marker, maybe. A courtesy, maybe. Something offered and left. I stepped down one stair without planning to. Snow gathered on my shoulders and melted at my collar. "Thank you," I said, the words small in all that weather and timber. He looked at me fully then, eyes catching warm even in that grey light, and held that look for a long breath. Not ownership, not demand. Recognition. In that gaze I felt the same thing I had felt by the alder run and in the meadow. I was not being tested, and I was not being judged. I was being accompanied. An hour before dawn, the snowfall thinned to fine grains, and the ridge went still again except for creek noise, under ice. He stepped backward from the yard in 3 quiet placements, turned at the timberline, and paused once as if making sure I had seen where the safe line ended and the wild began. Then he moved between the fir trunks and was simply gone, absorbed by shadow and weather without snapping branches or leaving any theatre behind him. I stayed on the porch until cold pushed through my boots. When I finally came inside, Blue was asleep again, chin on his bandaged paw, as if he trusted the night to finish itself without supervision. I sat at the table with a towel around my shoulders and watched the dashcam file save. My hands still shook a little from adrenaline, but underneath that tremor was a calm I had not felt since before Linda got sick. The world outside remained rough, indifferent in its weather, full of men who would set wire where living things moved. That part had not changed. What changed was my place inside it. Just before first light, I slept for maybe 40 minutes with my head on folded arms. When I woke, the sky had gone from charcoal to dull pearl, and the yard was fresh white, except where those broad tracks ringed the cabin in clear, deep loops. I opened the door to check Blue's bandage and found him already on the threshold, tail tapping once. He stepped out carefully, sniffed the nearest print, then circled twice and lay down beside it like he was keeping company with a friend who had already started home. I stood there with coffee cooling in my hand, eyes burning from short sleep and old grief and new relief, and felt no need to chase the timberline for one more glimpse. He had done what he came to do. He had protected what needed protecting, left room for me to do my part, and withdrawn with the same quiet discipline he had shown from the beginning. No claim, no demand to be believed. Just work finished well, then distance restored. I touched the 2 stones on the stump, then the smooth one in my pocket, and went inside to start making calls while the evidence was fresh and the morning still belonged to us. I called Warden Pike first, standing at Darlene's counter in wet socks, with Blue leaning against my knee and the dash cam file open on mute. He picked up on the second ring, voice clipped from road noise and morning coffee. Pike. It's Earl Jennings. I've got video from last night. 2 trucks on the switchback, clear lane footage, and fresh sign all over the porch perimeter. He was quiet, just long enough to signal he was writing. You safe right now? Yeah, they backed out. Good. Don't touch the road edge till I get there. Preserve tire pattern if we've got it. I also still have that bait sack from last week in the shed. Bag it tight and leave it sealed. I'll collect it. Then his tone softened a notch. You did this right, Mr. Jennings. Keep doing it right. When I hung up, I called Darlene. She answered with that scratchy morning voice treatment had given her, tired but sharp. You're up early, she said. Had visitors on the lower switchback. Chainline crew most likely. They turned around. A breath caught on her end, then steadied. You okay? I am. Blue's okay too. Paw looks clean this morning. Tell me you're not going down there alone. Pike's on his way. I'm staying put till he gets here. She paused and I could hear hospital hallway sounds behind her, a cartwheel squeaking somewhere. Earl? Yeah. I know you don't like praise, but I'm saying it anyway. You showed up. I looked out at the loops of prints around her porch and felt that sentence land in the deepest part of me. I'm trying to stay that way. By mid-morning, wet light had flattened the ridge into silver and bark brown, and Blue and I walked only as far as the lower gate while we waited. At the trailhead, just past the first bend, I found what I hadn't known to expect: 6 sprung snares, and 3 stakes piled neatly on the split cedar marker post, wire loops coiled, anchors lined by size like parts set out for inventory. Blue limped over, sniffed once, and lay down beside a giant fresh print pressed into thawing mud. Chin on his paws, as calm as porch sleep. I stood there with my gloves in one hand and felt my eyes sting all over again. Whoever had done that had done it for wardens to find, for evidence to hold, for harm to stop. Pike arrived 20 minutes later with another officer, Marin Holt, in a second truck. They photographed tire tracks first, then the snare pile, then the broad prints, then my dashcam placement. Pike took the bait sack from the shed with gloved hands and sealed it in a larger evidence bag. Holt copied my footage and phone photos to a state drive at the tailgate, while Sleet tried to start and failed. Pike crouched by one of the yard prints, looked at the depth, then looked at the tree line where no approach trail showed. He gave me a loaded glance I recognized from men deciding how much to say on record. Off to the side, low enough I almost missed it, he said, "My granddad worked trapline west of here. He used to talk about sign that showed up where bad actors moved, never where families did. Said these hills had their own wardens." He stood and went back to official voice. "For my report, I'm documenting recurring large bear sign associated with reduced poaching activity in this drainage. That gets us patrol authority and closure options." He never expanded past that, and I never asked him to. 3 days passed before Pike called back, with the outcome I had needed to hear in daylight terms. I was at Darlene's sink washing Blue's food bowl when my phone buzzed. "We got plate hits," Pike said. "Your dashcam and trailcam timestamps line up with 2 known associates from that chainline group. We've issued citations for trespass, illegal baiting, and prohibited snare sets. County judge signed temporary access restriction on the spur under active bear denning advisory." I leaned on the counter and shut my eyes. "They coming back?" "Not if they like keeping trucks and licenses." Papers rustled on his end. "We're posting closure signs this afternoon. You around?" I'll be waiting at the gate. At 2 o'clock, Pike and Holt met me at the lower switchback and bolted metal notices to 2 posts. Road closed. Seasonal wildlife protection / no entry without permit. They flagged the creek crossing with bright tape and logged coordinates. I signed a witness statement on the hood of Pike's truck, each line plain and factual. Bait sack recovered, snares recovered, repeated nocturnal vehicle activity, video submitted, no direct human confrontation. Physical evidence turned over complete. Chain of custody complete. I had spent a career trusting process, and watching process finally serve something tender felt like a mercy of its own. That Sunday, under a sky the colour of old tin, I drove to town to see Darlene after her infusion. She sat wrapped in a quilt by her apartment window, knit cap low, cheekbones sharper than I liked, but eyes bright and mischievous as ever. I set groceries on her counter, greens included so she wouldn't lecture me, and she pointed at the bag. "Look at you, buying vegetables without coercion." "Don't get used to it," I said, and she grinned. Then she got quiet and watched me with that sister look that sees through posture. "You're different in your shoulders," she said, less braced. I sat across from her and told her everything I could tell without asking her to carry my wonder-like proof. I described Blue's paw in the snare, the careful release in the meadow, the track loops at the road junctions, the stone cross on her stump. I told her I had cried on her porch and didn't apologize for it. When I finished, she held my gaze for a long time and nodded once. "World's bigger than we think," she said. "Sometimes kinder too." I swallowed. Yeah. By the second week of March, I met Cal before dawn at the co-op lot for my first volunteer anti-snare sweep with the local watch crew. No uniforms, no hero talk, just thermoses, bolt cutters, gloves, and men who had decided to stop pretending somebody else would fix it. We walked 2 drainages and cleared 4 illegal wire sets along a game trail that crossed private and public line. At one muddy junction, I found broad old impressions half collapsed by rain, placed exactly where a trespasser would hesitate. Cal saw me looking and said, "You still waiting for an explanation that fits in a coffee cup?" "Not anymore." He adjusted his hat and offered the closest thing to confession I'd ever heard from him. My dad saw the same pattern in 78 above the East Meadow, never talked about it in town. Said some truths do better without a microphone. He gave me a sideways smile. Doesn't make them less true. I went back to the mill part-time in late March. My superintendent, Don Avery, met me by the planer line with sawdust in his beard and concern he tried to hide behind schedule talk. "You sure you're ready for half shifts?" he asked. "I'm ready for honest work and fewer ghosts," I said. He studied me, then clapped my shoulder. "Good enough for me. You run safety checks first week. Ease in." I did. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the vibration through steel decking, the routine call and response of men who trust each other around dangerous machines. It all came back in layers. Work didn't erase grief. It gave grief a bench to sit on while life kept moving. In April, on a cold, clear morning with frost still silver in shaded grass, I drove Darlene up to the cabin for her first day back on the ridge. She walked slowly from truck to porch, one hand on my arm, Blue circling careful around her ankles. The yard held no fresh loops now. The big prints had long since melted into ordinary mud and then dried away. The stump still stood beside the steps, and 2 river stones still lay crossed on top where they had been set that night. Darlene touched them with 2 fingers, then looked out at the timberline and breathed deep like she was filling her lungs with home. We sat on the porch wrapped in coats and shared tomato soup from mugs because neither of us wanted to fuss with bowls. She talked about treatment side effects and small wins. I talked about patrol maps and mill shifts. Blue slept with his head on her boot. When wind moved through the firs, both of us looked up at the same time, listening. No spectacle came, no final reveal. Just quiet, creak noise, and the feeling of being accompanied by a landscape that had decided not to be empty. I keep one smooth stone from that stump in my truck's center tray now. The other stone stayed where it was, because not every gift is meant to be carried off. The notebooks are boxed in my hall closet with copies of reports and citation numbers. The dashcam files were archived to the wardens and then deleted from my phone after backup, because evidence had done its job. The bait sack and snares are in state inventory. The closure signs stayed up through calving season, and when patrol lifted them in early summer, no fresh chain-line sign returned to that drainage. Some people in town asked why I was volunteering so many pre-dawn sweeps all of a sudden. I told them the simple part. I got tired of standing by while wire did quiet damage. That answer was true. The fuller truth stayed where it belonged, between me, Blue, my sister, and those trees. I still miss Linda every day. That didn't lift like fog and disappear, but missing her no longer feels like a sentence I have to serve alone. It feels like love with work attached. Call your sister back. Feed the dog before he asks. Show up when there's mud and paperwork and no applause. Protect what's living right in front of you. When I park at the ridge gate at dawn and close my hand around that stone, I hear myself say the line that carried me through the hardest stretch. The world stayed hard, but it wasn't empty. I never needed to prove what kindness looked like at 9 feet tall. I only needed to recognize it, answer it, and keep watch.